Hey everyone, welcome to DevProt Eng Lowdown, as we call it, DPE Lowdown. We have a very special performance show, whatever you want to call it, for you guys today. Great conversations to be had. Today we're hosting Max from LinkedIn. He's on the knowledge systems. The name changed a few times, but they're the centralized developer productivity engineering team. I think it's developer productivity engineering and happiness, right, Max? That's the name of the org. And they support thousands and thousands of engineers from all sorts of platforms and products and whatnot. So we have Max here today. A few housekeeping rules. If you have any questions in your Zoom, there's a Q&A. Throw them in there. We're going to stop and take some questions here and there after each sections that are interesting. Baruch is going to be moderating the questions for us. Thanks for doing that, Baruch. And he might even answer some as it goes along. And then we'll try to get the rest at the end. We're trying to get this to the end of the hour. We'll see. So throw all your questions in there. Max, why don't you kick it off with telling us a little bit about yourself, what you do specifically, and what your team is all about.
Sure. So I'm the technical lead of a team at LinkedIn called Knowledge Systems. And as Ruz said, we are part of the Developer Productivity and Happiness Organization, which actually just recently changed its name to just the Productivity and Happiness Organization. And so Knowledge Systems, the team that I'm a part of, our mission is to help engineers and engineering managers understand what they need to understand in order to make the best decisions they possibly can. And we do this in all kinds of ways. Some of the most important are we help with quantitative metrics that help you understand help you make the best engineering decisions you can. Qualitative survey feedback systems that help you understand your users as infrastructure or tool owners. And we also have a docs and training team among actually various other different things that we have.
That's great. And, I spoke with a few folks from your team. First was Grant Jenks. He actually did a talk at the DPE Summit. There's a little slide for that. If you go to dpsummit.com, you get access to his talk. He actually did a lowdown as well. And DPE Lowdown, I think it was last year. That's on the YouTube playlist. Audience, go check that out if you want. And it was very interesting how much data and metrics your team kind of collects. And Grant talked about the dashboards that you created. And then Max, I sat down with you a few months ago and you said, well, here's what we do with all this stuff. Here's how we make sure stuff happens and how the whole organization operates. And I thought that was super interesting. And that's kind of what led us to this, sharing all that today. I wanted to start with a bit about, how you all define these productivity metrics. How does that process work with your team?
Sure. So it's a fairly involved process. And it depends on the area that you want to define metrics for. The most important thing is that you have a person who that owns the metric, right? And can write the definition for it. So let's say that you want to measure build time. You need to decide how you want to measure that and what's important about it. And the way that we do that is we have a framework that we call goals, signals, metrics that I learned from Sierra Jaspin at Google, who is the lead of their engineering productivity research team. And basically the way that works is what you do first is you set out what you're trying to accomplish as an organization. Like if you are the build platforms team, are you just trying, if you say make builds faster, well, what's the impact of that? What's the goal that we're trying to make happen for the business? Maybe it's, actually transform the experience of building so that it no longer impedes developers, or maybe let's improve iteration time or whatever, but you have to think about that up front because that actually heavily influences how you end up designing the metric. So one of the first things we do is we go and we have conversations with them, or, sometimes the managers just originate these things on their own. They say, here's our goals. And then we go and we talk to them about, okay, how would we measure that? And there's a bunch of back and forth just even at the beginning. So, this one of my rules is that I actually go and I help people I have these conversations with people. I have some background and expertise in how to design effective metrics that people will actually take action on. And there's really so many considerations in this area. There's things like who's going to look at the metric, how often are they going to look at the metric, and why are we measuring it? Among a million other things that we could talk about. And so we clarify this up front so that we're sure that we're going to measure the right thing that will actually produce the impact that we want to have in the world. And then we work together to we actually write out a definition, like in a document, which is both, and this is a little tricky, it's both a specification for the implementer to some degree, like not to the degree of like, hey, go query these data sources and here's the specific query you're going to write. But it's sufficient enough that there's no real ambiguity, not a huge amount of ambiguity in why we're measuring it and what you need and what it is that we're measuring. It defines maybe like the calculation in terms of English words that you would be doing to go calculate the metric. And then it also serves as documentation in the future for when people say, what is this really measuring? Like, I always encourage people to have really clear names for their metrics. Like, normally I'm not a stickler or a bike shedder around naming, but for this one, what happens is you get into a meeting with an executive and they say, I don't understand what this metric means because I don't understand that name. And then there's no impact occurs because all you're doing is having a conversation about the name, or you're not in the meeting and they look at your dashboard and they don't know what it means, so they don't do anything with it. So I try to tell people, let's have clear names, but even with the clearest name, there's going to be sometimes people have a question about specifically what is this measuring, and it's nice to be able to have a written version of that you can go and look at.
And all of this is this data, and Grant showed it, and this image of what he could show actually with your developer experience, kind of, which as you call it, dashboards. You also mentioned there's survey results that also get thrown in there as well, right?
Yes, for sure. We don't just measure quantitative metrics, but we also measure qualitative data, survey feedback, and our real-time feedback system. So we do a quarterly survey of developers where we ask them various different questions, including their satisfaction about the various different tools that they use. We aim to be the single platform that tooling organizations across the company can use to send out surveys so that we can reduce survey fatigue, so that you don't get like 5 different surveys from 5 different teams, but you get one survey that like at least somebody has curated and thought about how long is it going to be, how hard is it going to be to fill out, and we can provide some analysis infrastructure that the tool and infrastructure owners can use to understand the results. And then in addition to that, we have what we call a real-time feedback system, where occasionally when you take an action as a developer, you will get maybe an email or a Slack ping or a window inside of the application that you're using that says, hey, how was that experience? Was it good? Was it bad? Send us some feedback. And so,
are you getting a lot from, that part's really interesting, right? Because anybody could send a survey, but then that survey comes out 2 weeks later and the pain point's gone, right? Or the context is gone and nobody really remembers. So this real-time how much, so all this stuff goes into, so the surveys, the real-time feedback, all this data that you capture, maybe it could be build and test, all this stuff goes into this one dashboard. And what is this dashboard? I'm curious, like, Grant showed it for a few seconds on this slide, but what's in there that's really interesting? What's been the good stuff in there that people actually have fallen up with? Because I'm hearing more and more folks in our industry building these developer experience dashboards, right? What works in there, what doesn't? Sorry, we're going a bit off script here.
That's totally
but this idea just popped up. Like, what works, what doesn't work in those?
Sure. So our primary dashboard is called Insights Hub, or we call it iHub for short. That's sort of our branding, and it's been fairly popular across the company. And there's right now, we have many plans for Insights Hub, but there's 2 different major pieces of it. And one of them is the piece where you can see the quantitative metrics around things like, the code quality or like things like, testing, test flakiness or things like that, and developer productivity, and some of the like sort of the site type availability metrics for your services and your team. And then the other part is basically the survey analysis tool, like the system that lets you see the results from the combined results from our developer productivity survey and the real-time feedback system. And I think what's successful about those two things is different. So on the quantitative metrics side, there's two different types of success. One of them is when we have these global metrics and then people realize that all of a sudden they can measure something and act on something that they weren't able to measure and act on before. Like if we give them a really clear view of build time, we have seen teams like, hey, you know what? Let's actually have a strategic initiative to address build time this quarter. And because we can see that it's a real pain point that affects our developers in a quantitative fashion that's like actually significant. Not like, I kind of feel like builds are slow, but like actually this is worth investing resources into. And then you can actually see that improvement happen on the graph. This is a great story, right? And the other time we have impact is when people say, all these generalized metrics are great, but we have a very specific metric that is not really a metric that you'd use for the whole company, but is very relevant for the way that we do engineering in this team, or some specific aspect of our product that we're building that is not a universal aspect. And we want to have our own metric. And we have a process that we use to look at that. We have set expectations that people look at this on a regular basis. And so onboarding those like specific metrics for individual teams has been super helpful. On the survey analysis side, I think what's been the most helpful, the most successful, is doing detailed analysis and presenting this to the right stakeholders. Now, I think you're going to ask me a little bit more about that later. And so I want to save that more detailed conversation until you ask me some of the more specific questions, but that's the general idea on that one.
But before we jump into that, Baruch, do we have any good questions, any interesting questions from the audience that we want to throw out at Max?
No, yes, wait, still waiting for those to come in and trying to poke here in people. But yeah, it's I'm working on it.
All right. Okay. Well, let's jump into that part, because I thought that was the most interesting. You hear about different our partners or our colleagues that work in developer productivity and developer experience, where they capture these metrics, they try to help people, but sometimes stuff doesn't happen. Right. And so how do you get stuff to happen? And when you were telling me about your process, how you guys get VPs involved, Jared Green gets involved, folks like this, like, okay, so now stuff has to happen, right? Tell us a little bit. And you were talking about that whole process and working groups and all this. It was really interesting. Tell us a bit about what happens there.
Sure. So let me set the stage a little bit. There's, in some ways, parts of my team could be thought of as like a data team, like a team that builds dashboards and makes these things available. And that is the technical solution that is necessary. But the technical solution itself is insufficient, because getting people to change their minds is a human problem, right? And fundamentally, if you want engineering initiatives to happen, people have to change their minds. Managers have to make a decision, and hopefully engineers need to buy into that decision and believe it and understand it as they're going through it. It's very difficult as an engineer to just get a mandate and not have a deep understanding of the reasoning and the data behind it, because it's hard to make all the little decisions that you would need to make along the way. Whereas when you have like a coherent story that starts with data and explains the why, then you can make all those decisions, because you can go back and you can look at the reasoning and the data behind them. And so there's a human problem. There's a human problem. You can build the most beautiful dashboards in the world. You can define the greatest metrics in the world, and it possibly have nobody do anything with them at all, have no impact of any kind, right? So I think what we want to talk about today, which is one of the coolest success stories that I think we've had, is what we've called the developer personas system that we have at LinkedIn. one of the things so you mentioned Jared Green, who is my manager. He's the VP of Productivity and Happiness at LinkedIn, and he's like a really brilliant guy, and he's been working in the developer productivity field for decades. And one of the things that he did when he came to LinkedIn is he said, let's think of our developers as different types. Let's really think of backend developers as being different than web developers, and web developers as being different than SREs, and as all of those being different from data scientists or ML engineers, or mobile engineers, iOS and Android. They all live and all of these live in a very different world, and they all have very different workflows. And if you try to deliver the exact same tooling and workflow to all of them, then you miss. And anybody who's worked in a large tech company that tried to do this and was like, and if you were like a mobile engineer, or sometimes if you were even a web developer, you might have felt like, wow, why am I just getting a bunch of tools for backend engineers? Like, those aren't the tools that I need. I need tools for web developers, or SREs are like, I need tools for production management. Which is very different than what I need to write and maintain, say, a Java server. And so the first thing we did was we went out and we wrote workflow, like we wrote these documents that say, what are the different workflows? Like, let's get an idea of who these developers are, what are the tools they care about, what stakeholders would matter in this case, and then like basic numeric data, like how many of them do we employ, just so that we people can get an idea of like, oh, that's actually a really significant group of people. Maybe sometimes people don't know that already. Or maybe people don't know what those people work on. Just the basic information that can actually be super helpful for a productivity engineering team to be able to see like, oh yeah, wow, that's totally different than how I thought that group of people worked. But that alone doesn't make a massive change, right? It doesn't translate pain points into action. So what we did was we took the survey and all the real-time feedback systems, and we made it so that instead of like, there's no longer a central analyzer. Like, there's no longer one person who just analyzes all the survey responses and produces one report. Instead, we have grabbed a person who is a member of each of these developer personas. So we grabbed, for backend developers, we grabbed a particular backend developer and are like, you are now the representative for all backend developers at LinkedIn. And you are the interface between them and the infrastructure teams as far as things like survey analysis goes, right? Like, obviously we're not going to channel all requests through one person. That does not work. But as far as like survey analysis goes, you are the representative for all backend developers, and same for web developers, same for SREs, and all this thing. We call these people champions, persona champions. And these persona champions are the people who actually do the analysis. They read through all the free text feedback, they look at all of the satisfaction scores in the survey, and they produce an analysis individually on their own. One of the great things about them being a member of that persona is they have a sense of, what does this feedback mean? And which of these things are really painful. And also they have connections. They can go follow up and talk to people who they know who are working in the same field they do, to be like, give me more information. Because one of the things that you run into a lot of the time with survey systems is you get feedback like, this thing sucks. And that doesn't tell you why. And it doesn't tell you like, there's nothing actionable. But you can see a lot of people like expressing frustration in comments about whatever system it is. So it's actually helpful to be able to sometimes, have somebody who can go and talk to other people, and also who can relate to them and ask them very specific technical questions about the tooling that they use, because the person who's asking the question also uses that tooling.
And that's really interesting, Max. I got to ask you a quick follow-up on that. So would this be like, for example, I work closely with, used to work even closely with LinkedIn Android folks. And so like Curtis and Drew, and are you saying these persona champions, are they on your team, or are they like application developers working on LinkedIn Android, or would they just be the person responsible for builds and tests? Like, where do they, you know what I mean? Because when you, if you, sometimes when you don't have the people that are actually in the trenches doing the day to day, you might miss some of what's really important. That's, I think, what you were alluding to. So are these folks like working on both teams, or are they, yeah, how does that part work?
Yeah, we prefer that they are a team who's that they're a member of a team that's in the trenches, that they are an application or library developer outside of our team. You know, we are to some degree asking them to do volunteer work, and that work can be a fair bit of work. So, you know, there sometimes we have to rely on somebody who is closer to us, but we always want it to be somebody who is intimately familiar with that workflow. You know, even if the representative is an infrastructure developer, we want it to be an infrastructure developer who actively does that kind of development, even if it's within infrastructure.
Is it hard to get those folks to participate? I mean, they care about developer productivity and engineering anyway. They're passionate about it, but it's not their full-time job. Do you have any challenges there for getting these folks to want to be the champion, per se?
Yeah.
Or are they just volunteer? Are folks just volunteering? I mean, and I guess it's different at different companies, right? Based on how much you care about the productivity engineer. But I'm just curious, how's that at LinkedIn?
Yeah, the key is working with management to make sure that you have actually got a person assigned and that you have them allotted sufficient amounts of time to work on this. I think if you just try to go rogue and do it with volunteers without going through management, you're just going to cause chaos. Because you're going to try to take a lot of time. And honestly, almost all the people who work on this are fairly senior engineers. So, because to some degree you have to be in order to have the insight and the connections to be able to do the work. So if you just show up and you're like, you know, I'm going to steal 20% of a senior staff engineer's time, nobody's going to let you do that.
That's not going to go over too well.
Yeah.
Another challenge that we see, right? Well, we have these like smaller organizations or smaller teams, smaller customers where, you know, it's like, well, I don't have a dedicated Dell productivity engineering person, but I'm doing it part-time. I'm doing it anyway. I'm doing it part-time. And it's, so what you're saying resonates really well, right? Do you, it's kind of like, hey, I got to get this feature out the door, but I got this 20% towards productivity engineering persona champion that I am. You guys deal with that a bit there?
You know, we do, but we deal with it on a longer time frame, where if there is that concern, then we want to work with the manager to get another person assigned. Yeah. Be like, okay, let's try not to have a gap period where we have a survey, but there's nobody to do a survey analysis of that. We want people to raise that with us proactively. And because the people that we're working with are fairly senior, they're usually pretty good about telling it to us themselves. You know, if they come to us and they're like, look, realistically, right now, I can't do this. I have to be heads down on a project that's really important for the business. And we need to work out a different solution. So then we go to the relevant sets of managers and ask them. And there's a TPM, a technical program manager who works with me, and his name is Vineet, and he has been really stellar at making that happen.
Well, it seems like we got a lot of questions from the audience here. Baruch, any good ones that we should have next?
Oh yeah. I guess we kind of steered a hornet's nest here. Lots of very good questions. And there are a couple very, very related to what we just spoke about. So I guess we'll start with them. And the first is when, Max, when you spoke about that there are different personas, front-end engineer is nothing like back-end engineer. There is a question here that this separation or differentiation can even go deeper. We can distinguish personas inside a single group. For example, conservators, feature drivers, experimentators. Do you do anything of that sort?
This is a great question. So it depends on the area. One of the things that I think how you do this depends on why you're doing it. So the reason that the primary motivator for our developer personas was survey and metric analysis. And if a cohort is too small, you can't get statistically significant information out of it. Like what you don't want is you don't want to have an argument about that number went up or down because the response rate is too low. Like if every quarter you're trying to convince infrastructure and tool owners to make changes based on pain points, and they say, but we don't believe your data. We don't actually think that got worse for everybody because you've only got 20 respondents and that number isn't statistically significant, then we can't have an impact. So my guidance has been that we wanted the personas to encompass at least 200 people, roughly, for an engineering org of thousands of people. But some of the larger ones do have sub-personas, like SRE, for example, at LinkedIn has various different sub-personas. And just like SRE in every organization, some people are going to be more tooling focused and some people are going to be more operations focused. And those workflows are remarkably different, actually. Even though you're both SREs, what you could be doing and what tools you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis can be remarkably different. So there's a balance that you have to strike between having a totally accurate view of everybody's workflow and having statistically significant number of data points when you're doing surveying or feedback.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And speaking about the same area, so there is a question, are the surveys actually different for those different groups? Or is it the same survey and you differentiate in post-analysis based on the groups?
The surveys are different for every individual engineer at LinkedIn. We actually have telemetry that knows which tools you used in the quarter and only asks you about them if you used them. So if we don't have that telemetry, then we bracket the questions based on persona. So, but every person, and you can be in multiple personas. Some people are both SREs and backend developers. They have both of those workflows. Some people are front-end and backend developers. They have both of those workflows. You would get both of the sets of questions in that case. So some questions, the ones that we can do based on telemetry are based on telemetry, and the ones that we can't are limited by what persona you're in.
Nice. That's awesome. And going back to our discussion about dashboards, there are a couple of questions about that. So first of all, when we spoke about defining roles and defining the goals, so here is the question: how do you manage the conflict between management and developers? For example, the goal of having happiness and developer productivity versus shipping features faster.
So what we hope to try to get alignment on all of those things. And part of that is in how we define the metrics. I mean, obviously, it is up to managers to have judgment, right? Like there's no technological system that just tells you, here's how you prioritize everything. Like the reason that managers exist and are human beings is because we need human beings who have judgment to be able to make these decisions. But for human beings to make good decisions, they need data. And ideally, they need accurate data that's easy to consume. So what we hope is that if we show you, hey, here's the qualitative and quantitative information about what developer pain points are, and we make this real to you, look, maybe this is impacting your ability to ship quickly. And maybe that's what you care about. Or maybe it's impacting the happiness of your developers, and that's what you care about. Because one thing to keep in mind is what motivates different people is actually different. And it's not like and that's another thing I think that sometimes people who work in the field of data make a mistake about, is that we are very often very analytical and we care very deeply about data, but that is not actually the thing that motivates everybody. Sometimes people are more motivated by people who work for me are unhappy. So we want to show them that too.
Yep, that makes sense. And this brings me to a next question. It's a huge one, but I love it because it's so big. So how do you define productivity as a metric? Or maybe it's kind of a combination of metrics that in the end of the day come together as an insight or I mean, in the end of the day, productivity is the metric. How do you go about that? It's so big.
I'm going to throw one more on top of while you're doing that, Max, because I got a lot of this from our folks at large software organizations that are trying to spin up developer productivity and developer experience teams. And they're like, hey, how do I even go to CTO level and say, I need money to do this. I need a team. I need tools, stuff like that, right? What do those folks maybe even care about? Because you have this, you're reporting to the VP, right? How does that work? How can the answers that you give help, our audience? What's worked,
Wow.
I guess.
You guys really have asked a huge question.
Right? It is huge.
Yeah, that's a huge one. So let me try to distill the essence of the question. So the essence of the question is, how do you measure productivity? Like, what is productivity? Well, what is it? And how do you do that at different levels? Because it's different at different levels of the organization, right? Okay, I've written a lot about this, and I've thought about a lot about it, and it has been part of the quest of my career for the last few decades. The biggest problem that people have with measuring productivity is defining the word productivity. Like, if you ask a person, what do you mean? They will not be able to tell you. And that is why they cannot measure it. You cannot measure a thing that does not exist and that has no definition. So there's different ways of looking at this productivity. The two lenses that I tend to use are the tools and systems that we provide for productivity being effective, okay? And is the company in some way productive? Like, does it produce results, right? It is actually usually easier and more effective to focus on do my tools and systems produce results? Because that is useful for the tool and infrastructure developers. Now, at the higher level, if you are the VP of engineering or the CTO, you care about, in general, are we productive? Okay? Those are different metrics with different views, different levels of granularity, and different purposes. For tool and infrastructure developers, the word productivity means efficient and effective. That's what it means. It means, are we enabling our developers to be efficient and effective? And you actually want to split out those two things. Efficient is basically, can we do things rapidly, both the total amount of time they take and the iterations, like how fast is an individual iteration within all of the different activities throughout the developer lifecycle. There's a lot more to know about that. I'm massively oversimplifying it here. And then effective is basically, I have an intention as a developer. Does that intention get accomplished? And how hard is it to accomplish that intention? And how you design your metrics for that vary wildly depending on what that intention is. Like, an example that I give sometimes is, let's say you want to measure build speed. Okay, but what intention, or let's say you want to measure, like, people have come to me and be like, well, I want to measure build success. That's a better one for effective. And I'm like, I always ask them why. Like, what does that tell you? And a lot of that, sometimes they haven't thought about it, because in some cases, you expect builds to fail. Like, when you are iterating locally as a developer, a build failing is a valuable signal. It tells you there's a bug in my code. In fact, you want that signal as fast as possible. You want that to ideally, appear in the IDE as a little red squiggle, and then right after that, you want it to appear in a very fast duration loop of the build tool, right? So in that case, like, what you might care about, like, okay, how fast do those individual iterations return? And do developers agree that, I'm getting valuable signal out of those iterations, right? So that one might actually just be purely efficiency. Like, the effectiveness of that one might be identical to its efficiency, right? But on the other hand, let's say that you care about, like, well, one of the things I'm concerned about is I feel like this particular library is very difficult to use, and so there's lots of build failures as people are going through it. And so what I want to see is I want to see the total amount of time from when a build first fails to when it succeeds. And that tells us something about the effectiveness of developer workflows in that situation. Like one metric that I worked with once upon a time was something we were calling test effectiveness, which is basically how often do you see this pattern happen? Test fails, developer changes the test, or developer changes the code under test, the system under test, test passes. That's like the virtuous cycle that you want to see for a test, right? But that shows you effectiveness, but it's very based on intention, because my intention is I want this test to be effective. I want it to give me useful information that makes me fix my code. What I don't want to do is what you don't want to see is test fails, developer changes only the test, and then test passes. That's the bad cycle, right? So you can actually measure both of those things and you can compare them. You can say ratios, and that metric actually ends up being super interesting. It's very hard to measure on small scales, but you can measure it at the size of large numbers, because trying to see that number of iterations that happen and get all that data from local builds can be a challenge. But
it's interesting because it's fine that you fixed something in the test that you got it wrong. So you really need big numbers in order to get.
Yeah, in order to weed out the noise, you need large numbers, right?
Yes, it's about faster feedback cycles, right? Like how fast is the tool chain for this person to be able to fix the system underlying the test and maybe runs it again and it fails and then eventually it passes, right? And so that it kind of shows.
That's all kind of interesting stuff. They run one test and it passes, but then they run all of them and this test fails. Well, there is so much to unpack.
Yeah, there's.
Yeah, and I think Rose, you've highlighted one point that's interesting: the difference between effectiveness and efficiency there. Because efficiency is how quickly that loop happens, and effectiveness is that it happens.
Yeah.
So like the metric, you actually have two different metrics. You have one metric that just counts how many times it happens, and then another one that measures how quickly it happens.
Yeah. And this could be, we could spend forever on this one question and topic, but if you were to boil this up, Max, what I've seen at, upper management level, it's kind of like developer happiness, which comes to ties into this efficient effectiveness. And then it's, hey, we need to get features out the door. We need to go to market with this new feature kind of faster. And is that what you've seen as well? Is there something else that these folks are looking at these days? What's you have one-on-ones with leadership or engineer productivity in our space all the time. Where's the trend going?
The trend is all over the place. Different people are at different stages of the data journey, and there's really no standardization right now across the industry in terms of measuring these things. The closest we have is there's a lot of agreement on the DORA metrics, which have to do with software delivery mostly, like the efficiency and effectiveness of software delivery. And so that's probably been the most popular set of metrics that's caught on. But outside of that, there's no consistency. Some of it's the difficulty of measuring the different pipelines. Some of it's the difficulty of visualizing it in an effective way. Some of it's how different everybody's developer workflows are across the company, across the industry. There's all kinds of things. Yeah. There is one other half of Baruch's question that I think I should get to, which is I am the, and the one that you asked, which is I am the CTO, and I just care about how much of we're doing, right? Like how much are we resulting in and how much are we actually shipping? And I'll just try to address that really briefly. In that case, productive means is effective at producing products. Like is effective and efficient at getting things done, basically. And a lot of the time what you care about is actually your change over time in the impact metrics of the business. Like if you want to say, because like really the ultimate result is whatever metric you track for the business that represents your impact on the world, you want to see that accelerate. And you want to be able to tie that acceleration back to initiatives that you initiated. And you can do that both with the qualitative feedback, where you ask developers like, hey, do you feel better about this now? Is it going better? One of the important things to know is that in most studies, developers' happiness is an indicator of their productivity. If you ask them, or their satisfaction with their own productivity is a valid question. Like if you ask them, I regularly reach high levels of productivity, that actually ends up being true. They're not usually just PRing you. They will actually tell you the truth. And so you can see that change. Also, sometimes on a delay, see an impact in the business metrics. That's what you want to see. You don't have to tie those together perfectly. You don't have to be like, here's my perfect chain of data that does the whole thing. But if you can say, look, we've had a good result on the business metrics, our qualitative feedback says people are doing well, and we have a few little quantitative indicators that show that our tooling has improved, that's usually pretty good.
Oh yeah, definitely answer the question how you tie it up to the management, and they says this is good. There are a couple of more technical questions about the dashboards. For example, do you get the data from different tools, or the dashboard is just bunch of like master page was linked to those specific tools?
No, you don't want to have a bunch of dashboards. Ideally, you want to have one dashboard that has everything in it. Otherwise, you have what we call dashboarditis, where nobody knows where to go. And like you don't want to go to a VP of engineering and say, oh yeah, you want to do a review of your area? Just look at these 12 dashboards.
Baruch, before we take any more, I have one last topic, and then we'll get to some more Q&A as well. Max, we're going to talk about these working groups and what happens after you kind of collect this data. I thought this was really interesting, right? So you have the liaisons, and so what happens next?
Sure. So we have these persona champions who take the feedback data, and we actually went through a few different iterations over time of what we did. At first we just had this one group called the Developer Productivity Working Group, and it was basically a bunch of different infrastructure leaders across the company would all get together and we'd all talk. And I think when we were first doing this, that was really helpful because it was a forum where everybody could communicate. But over time, it became less useful because not every persona readout is going to be interesting to every infrastructure owner in the room. They just don't all provide infrastructure to all those personas. And it also limits the number of people that can be in the room. Like you can really only have like the VPs and like some senior directors and stuff like that in the room, because otherwise you have like 50 people in the room and you can't have a conversation. What you want to be able to do is have a conversation. Like, tell me more about that pain point. Let's talk about what we could do to address it. Have you talked to those other teams who are working on it? So what we did was we actually split it into separate working groups for every persona. There's one manager usually who is the owner of that meeting, and they are the infrastructure owner most closely associated with that particular persona. But then they work with our TPM organization to make sure that all of the relevant stakeholders who either should be there on a regular basis or who have feedback specifically for them in the persona readouts attend that meeting for that quarter. And so far, that's been way more effective.
So how often does this happen? So let's just so we have a lot of Java backend services folks here. So let's say give us an example, like Java backend. There's a lot of them at LinkedIn, right? Who would sit in that meeting? How often does it happen?
Okay, sure. So, let's say you're the backend organization, we're talking about the backend persona champion, right? So they bring their readout, which is a document which they've sent out as a pre-read, usually a few days in advance. And at that meeting is, one of our directors of developer productivity who most closely focuses on the tools that Java engineers use. Another director who owns Java libraries at LinkedIn. And then whatever sets of managers own the tools that are usually the top pain points for developers that quarter. And that's who attends. Yeah.
And then what comes out of this meeting? What happens next? You talked about earlier, like, hey, sometimes you have the best data and the best result. survey responses and nothing happens. How do you make sure stuff happens and it's like, hey, you have to fix X, Y, and Z to hit your numbers to ship software in time, and they probably have their own priorities of what they think is it. And then you have, hey, we recommend this, so just what do you do so it's not just that here's a recommendation that we spent so much time putting together, and nothing happens? Or
one of the things that I encourage the persona champions to do is not to provide recommendations and only to explain the problems. Because what works better is if the infrastructure owners are in the room, because, they genuinely care about our developers. They really want to do the right thing by our developers. And if they see, wow, this is really bad and the trend is going down, they can actually take that into their planning cycle. So we try to time this with the planning cycle so that the analysis happens shortly-ish before we do planning. Like at least a few weeks or a month before we do planning, so that teams can have time to digest the information and start to think, maybe we need to go in a new direction. Realistically, when you have a large engineering organization, some of these are going to be strategic initiatives that take weeks or months to accomplish, right? And they're not going to interrupt their current strategic direction just to take on an immediate new thing, just because it happened to show up in this quarter's survey analysis. But what it will do is be like, let's start these conversations. Let's be like, hey, you know what? We see that this is a problem. And this is especially effective when it repeats. When you see it multiple quarters over and over and over, it becomes more and more effective on, you know what? We need to actively take action on this. And because we have basically assigned the meeting leads as the people who are responsible for seeing that action occurs, and they're also the people who have the power to make action occur, like they're the directors of the teams who actually run the infrastructure teams, that's now an expectation. That's an expectation from their management that they actually do this, and that they solve that, and that they move the needle on some of our our most important satisfaction scores.
Hey, you guys are so mature when it comes to developer productivity engine. It's not just collecting the data, but the whole process behind it. If the whole company has bought into this, basically, and that's we're really we're very exciting and great to see, kind of for our audience to see, like, hey, this is how it could be. And there's no secret why LinkedIn can ship software so well, right, and retain amazing engineering talent. And it's because of folks like you, Max, right? That's pretty amazing. Thanks for sharing all that. But we got 7 minutes left. We probably won't get through all the questions, right?
Oh yeah.
Let's
There,
good ones.
there are so many great questions. And I think that
Another thing we can do, Baruch, is if Max is okay with it, if you could throw a link to the Gradle community Slack. There's a DPE, I think it might be a Lowdown or something. If we don't get anything in here, folks can throw it in there. And when Max has time, he's on vacation in Florida right now, but when he has time, he can come back and chat with some of those. No pressure, Max, but we probably won't get through everything.
Oh, I'm right. So I'm happy to answer those questions.
you're sitting in here just under my right there, right. There, here we go, right there. Right. So, but yeah, there are a couple of questions that we will probably have time to get into. One is smaller, the other one, maybe it makes sense to finish with it. So the smaller question is, what is your relationship with Microsoft as being the parent organization? The amazing practices that you show us here, do they kind of made their way up to Microsoft as well? Because I guess all of us are very invested in seeing Microsoft being productive.
Yeah, so I can't speak to Microsoft's engineering practices because the way that we're structured is that the only person at LinkedIn who reports to Microsoft is our CEO, Ryan Ruslansky, and otherwise we are basically an independent organization. So I definitely talk to my compatriots at Microsoft, and I always welcome more people from Microsoft to come and talk to us if they want. We have conversations with them all the time, and we definitely share knowledge and experience and all sorts of ideas about developer productivity, but we are separate.
Mm-hmm. So you guys do get together with their developer. Do you have your own meetup or whatnot quarterly to share and collaborate? And
yeah, we have all kinds of ways of interacting.
cool.
So yeah, let's hope they will hear from you and take a lot of the questions. So if we can show the QR code once again, because probably people didn't have time to see it, that would be in it. Thank you very much. Okay, and I guess we have 5 minutes, and then perfect for the last question, which is: we have an organization, medium-sized, 100 plus developers. What should a platform team have in place that might signal that we are on the right path for improving developer productivity and this scale? Right, so quarterly surveys, collecting metrics that enable team, what else? Considering that it might be not as huge as LinkedIn in terms of the data points and in terms of the resources that we can invent. How a smaller company can go ahead and start this journey to develop productivity and happiness?
The easiest thing to do is to start with a survey. It doesn't have to be a very deeply designed survey, but you can do, you can ask people, hey, I ask people to rate from 1 to 5. I regularly reach a high level of productivity, and ask them for their pain points, even just their text feedback. If it's just 100 people, you can easily read through all that text feedback. Don't try to make it a very long survey. You want to get everybody to respond, especially at first. At first, you want just the most general feedback you can get, because the largest pain points will be obvious. So they'll just show up, and that's what you want. At first, what you want is what's the most important large section of things. Because if you've got 100 people and 20 of them tell you, hey, we got some huge problem with our code review process, then you're like, oh, we need to fix that. And that's going to be the thing. And honestly, with an amount of time that you can probably dedicate to developer productivity, that's going to be what you're going to be able to tackle. So you're not going to get like a huge benefit of like, hey, we're going to stand up a very complicated dashboard and we're going to spend a lot of time instrumenting metrics. The only thing that I would say is that if you expect to grow in a significant way, it's worth thinking up front a little bit about the data that your systems produce and if they are measurable. Because going back later and trying to instrument all of them, your developer productivity systems, can be very challenging. I'm not saying that you need to go and invest in like a ton of like work to make sure that you have beautiful dashboards, but thinking up front, like, do they create offline tables that make sense, that if somebody had a question, they could go look at? And how are we thinking about this? And have we designed our systems in such a way that we could get data out of them when we want to in the future? It is worth thinking about at least a little bit as part of the design process or design discussions around your developer productivity workflows.
Baruch, is there going to be a particular channel in the Gradle community Slack where folks can throw more questions at Max?
Yeah. Let's see the exact name so we will know.
There's a developer productivity engineering channel. We could throw stuff in there.
I think that's the right place. I don't want like to separate it for only this meetup or only this Lowdown, because I want more people to hear it. So developer productivity engineering is definitely a great place. And let's all go there and keep talking over there.
Great. Thank you, Baruch. And of course, thank you, Max. I mean, you've done this for so many years. The knowledge from Google and LinkedIn and, in the weeds with the engineering and in the trenches and dealing with management. I mean, this insight's been incredible. And I hope you, thanks for taking time to join. And I hope you submit a talk at the DPE Summit in San Francisco, September 2021. And we'll see you all soon.